Let us recall the definition of domain and range of a function. The set of inputs is called the domain of the function, while the set of outputs is called the range of the function. Graphically, we can represent this by this diagram. So if our input is 3 and our output is 4, that is represented by this point. So if you're going to move this point here, the input is now -3 and the output is now +2. We're going to move it from to here, so our input now here is -4 and our output is -2. Kung dito mo naman siya ilagay, so our input is 2 and our output is -3. We recall also this function where the domain is specified. In this case, the domain is specified as 1, 2, and 3, and the range is specified as 1 and 2. The independent variable is x and the dependent variable is y. The function is represented by these points. Sometimes no specific domain is given. So for example, the function f of x is equal to x squared. We try to graph the function f of x is equal to x squared if x is, or if the input is equal to 1, the output is equal to 1, and that is represented by this point. If x is equal to 2, the output is 4, evaluating to f of x is equal to x squared. If x is equal to 0, y is equal to 0. If x is -1, the output is 1. If x is -2, the output is 4. Pero may mga values pa yan in between, like if x is equal to 1/2, that is equal to 1/4. So if you continue all the points in x, that will give you this graph of f of x is equal to x squared. So the domain of this function are actually all values of x, while the range are all values of y that are greater than or equal to 0. To give more illustration to the domain and range, let us consider this function f1. Okay, so ulit. So if you observe, okay, itong yellow point na yan, if you're going to trace back to the x-axis, that will correspond to this input. Okay, so ititrace natin siya. So lahat ng points dito, okay, this point corresponds to this output. This point corresponds to this output. Itong point na yan, ito yung output niya. And moving on, this point here, ito yung output. Okay. So at this point, the input is 0. Okay, then moving on to this point, the input is here. So lahat ng mga values na naka-red, sila yung mga input mo, set of inputs. And so they are the domain. For the range naman, so those are the y values. So we start from here, okay? So again, dito na point. So kung dito na point, ito naman yung kanyang output. Okay? Ito naman yung kanyang point, ito naman yung kanyang output. Moving on to this. So ititrace din niya siya. So this point and this point corresponds to this output. And so on, so on. Ito yung pinaka-last. Okay, so this point corresponds to that output. Okay, so take note that dito na side, may tatlo tayong point na natamaan. No? So drawing horizontally. Pero that corresponds to the one output. Okay, so yung naka-green naman, these are now the range of the function. Let us consider another example. Okay, for this function, trace natin yung domain. Ayan. Okay, putol tayo dito because the function do not have values there. Pero pagbalik mo dito, ayan. So, these are the two domains. For the range naman, we will trace horizontally. Ayan. Okay, so these are now the y values. Although na putol itong putol ito dito banda, but if you're going to trace that horizontally, yan, may mga points kasi din dito. Okay, that is why if you're going to trace that back, makukuha pa rin yung kanyang y values. Kaya yung kanyang range is from this point up to this point. For F3, okay, trace natin. This is now the domain. Ito naman yung range. For this particular example, this one is the domain and ito naman yung kanyang range. So going back to this example, this is the graph of f of x is equal to x squared. So iti-trace natin ano yung kanyang domain. So for this particular point, the value of the input is this point also. For this particular point, i-trace mo doon sa x, ito yung kanyang input. Ito naman, ito yung kanyang input. And of course, there are many points here. So, itong point, ito naman, and so on. So, since this graph continues infinitely, so mauubos yun siya lahat. So, that is why the set of all inputs are all x or all real number x na nandito sa line na ito. Okay, now for the range, okay, so iti-trace naman natin siya horizontally. Okay, so for this particular point, the point for y is this one. For this point C, ito naman yung kanyang point doon. Actually, these 2 points. Itong A, ito naman yung kanyang point together with D. Okay. For this point, trace mo horizontally, nasa 4, and so on. So, take note that it will increase pataas, but there are no values below 0. That is why the range is from this point, 0 of y, up to infinity. So that is why for this particular function, okay, so any number can be squared. So the domain of this function is the set of real numbers. Okay, so sometimes, now consider the function defined by f of x is equal to square root of x. We know that square root of x is a real number if x is non-negative, meaning x is greater than or equal to 0. So hindi pwedeng maglagay ka dito ng value ng x na negative. Kailangan ang value ng x dito ay 0 lang or a positive number. So the domain of this function is the set of non-negative real numbers. If you're going to look at the graph of f of x is equal to square root of x, ito yung kanyang graph. Okay, so mapapansin niyo no, na lahat ng mga values ng x dito ay mga positive values lang or 0. And there is no value to the left of it. Ayan, so there is no outputs there. Okay, so again, to trace that, so kung iti-trace mo siya for this particular point, 0, ito na point naman, ito 8, ito na point at 10, and so on. So again, this graph here will continue up to infinity. Consider the following function defined by f of x is equal to 2 over x. So 2 over x is a real number if x is not 0. Take note that we are not allowed to divide a number by 0. So x in the denominator cannot be 0. So thus, the domain of this function is the set of real numbers except 0. If you're going to look at the graph of f of x is equal to 2 over x, that one will look like this graph. So the domain are all values of x except 0. So take note that the graph will continue to increase, but it will never touch the y-axis. Ito naman, it will continue to decrease up to negative infinity, but it will not touch the y-axis. So this is asymptotic to this line here, to the y-axis. So we are not allowed to have values x is equal to 0.